Imagine two men taking the same DNA test on the same afternoon. One grew up in Salvador, on the coast of Brazil. The other grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Both men are black. Both trace their roots back to Africans who were stolen from their homes, chained together, and shipped across the same ocean. Logic says their DNA results should look almost identical, like two brothers separated by distance, but they don't. And once you understand why, you'll see one of the most uncomfortable truths that science has ever confirmed. For a long time, this information stayed buried inside research papers that most people never read, because turning it into everyday language forces us to look straight at parts of slavery's history that got softened for generations. Today, we're going to lay out exactly what the science shows. No sugarcoating, no polite version. By the time this is over, you'll understand how two people who come from the exact same African ancestors ended up carrying two completely different stories inside their own bodies. Let's start with what actually connects them, because this part is real. Somewhere around 12.5 million African people were forced onto slave ships between the 1500s and the 1800s. They were taken from a coastline stretching for thousands of miles, from Senegal in the north down past Angola in the south. These were people from dozens of different kingdoms, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods. To the slave traders, none of that mattered. They were treated as cargo. But biologically, this was one of the most diverse groups of human beings ever forced together. Nearly every black person living in the Americas today, whether their family history runs through Brazil, the United States, Jamaica, or Colombia, can trace their roots back to this same tragedy, same continent, same ships, same chains. So, on the surface, you'd expect the ancestry to line up almost perfectly between all these populations. And this is exactly where the story starts to fall apart. What actually decided everything wasn't where these people started. It was where the ships dropped them off. And almost nobody realizes just how unbalanced that was. Brazil didn't take a portion of the enslaved people brought to the Americas. Brazil took the biggest share of any country on the planet. Close to 5 million enslaved Africans were sent there. That number isn't a mistake. 5 million people. That's close to 40% of every enslaved African brought to the entire Western Hemisphere. Now compare that to the United States. The number most people assume is massive is actually surprisingly small. Fewer than 400,000 enslaved Africans were shipped directly to what became the United States. Under 400,000, compared to Brazil's nearly 5 million, that's a difference of more than 10 to 1. Hold on to that number because it sets up a contradiction we need to untangle. Here's the part that doesn't add up at first glance. If Brazil brought in more than 10 times as many enslaved Africans as the United States, logic says Brazil's black population today should be enormous compared to America's, by roughly that same ratio. That's not what happened. The reason is brutal. The enslaved people sent to Brazil were, on average, worked to death faster than new children could replace them. The sugar plantations along Brazil's northeastern coast, along with the gold mines further inland, consumed human lives at such a horrifying pace that ship owners had to keep sending more captives just to maintain the workforce. The United States followed a different pattern, not because it was gentler, but because of a grim demographic accident. The enslaved population in the American South actually began increasing through birth rather than constant new arrivals, something almost unheard of anywhere else in the enslaved Americas. So America imported far fewer people, but those people had children, and their children had children, and generation after generation, the population kept growing. Brazil, meanwhile, brought in wave after wave of new captives and buried most of them before they ever had descendants. That one fact, one system multiplying its victims while the other system used them up, is stamped directly into the DNA of both populations today. But that's really just the surface, because it's not only about how many people arrived or how long they survived once they got there. It's also about exactly which parts of Africa they were taken from and what happened to them after they landed. That second part of the story is where things get even harder to hear. Africa was never one single place, and treating it like a single homogeneous region is one of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about the slave trade. The coastline that slave traders raided held more cultural and genetic diversity than all of Europe put together. And the ships weren't pulling evenly from that coastline. Different ports fed different colonies, and over time these shipping routes became fixed patterns that still show up clearly in DNA results collected 5 centuries later. Brazil pulled the majority of its enslaved population from 2 main regions. The first was West Central Africa, the huge territory around modern-day Angola and the Congo, home to Bantu-speaking peoples. The second was the region known as the Bight of Benin, tied to the Yoruba, Igbo, and Fon peoples. You might have heard this stretch of coastline referred to historically as the Slave Coast. And nowhere did that heritage take root more firmly than in the Brazilian state of Bahia, which became one of the most West African places anywhere outside of the African continent itself. You can still hear it today. Candomblé, the Afro-Brazilian religious tradition centered on the Orixás, is essentially Yoruba spiritual practice that survived the Atlantic crossing and refused to disappear. The names given to the deities, the drumming patterns, the ritual offerings, the language woven into the ceremonies, all of it points directly back to what is now Nigeria and Benin. The DNA and the living culture are telling the exact same story because in Bahia, the connection to that specific corner of Africa stayed strong enough to survive slavery, poverty, and 100 years of pressure to abandon it. The United States tells a much more scattered story. America didn't draw heavily from just one or two African regions. It pulled from nearly the entire coastline. Senegambia in the far northwest, the Bight of Biafra, home to the Igbo people, the Gold Coast, connected to the Akan peoples, Sierra Leone. The result was a genetic mixture, an averaging out of the whole West African coast rather than the concentrated ancestry you find in a place like Bahia. There's one striking exception in the United States that still surprises researchers, and it exists on a chain of islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. The Gullah Geechee people preserved more direct African heritage than nearly any other community in the country. Their food, their language, their basket weaving, their farming methods all trace back to the rice-growing societies of West Africa. Slave traders specifically targeted people who already knew how to cultivate rice, so certain regions were deliberately targeted, and the isolation of these coastal islands protected that heritage long after it faded away on the mainland. Then researchers made a discovery that genuinely didn't match the paperwork. When scientists compared modern DNA results against the actual historical shipping records, some regions showed up in the DNA far more than the records could explain, while others nearly disappeared. Nigerian ancestry, for example, shows up much more strongly in African American DNA than direct shipping records to North America can account for. For a while, this made no sense. The paper trail was clear, so where were all these Nigerian ancestors actually coming from? The answer turned out to be a hidden second stage of the trade. People weren't always shipped straight from Africa to their final destination. Many were first taken to the Caribbean, held there, sold, and then forced onto ships a second time and moved again into North America. This internal trade within the Americas scrambled the historical map. Someone whose paperwork says they arrived from Barbados might actually carry deep ancestral roots from what is now Nigeria. The genome remembered the true starting point even when the official records only listed the last stop along the way. And then there's the opposite problem, ancestry that seems to have vanished almost entirely. Senegambia, the region closest to Europe and one of the earliest areas targeted by slave traders, shows up far less in today's gene pool than historical records would suggest it should. The reason is horrifying in how simple it is. Death rates from that region were staggering. Many of the people taken from certain areas never survived long enough to have children at all, so their genetic line simply stopped. When a population barely appears in the DNA of people living today, sometimes that's because that population was worked into extinction. So even before we look at a single percentage of European ancestry, these two groups have already split apart. Brazil concentrated its ancestry. America blended it. Bahia held tightly to one corner of Africa, while the American South mixed the entire continent together and then reshuffled it again through the Caribbean. Two populations sharing the same origin story, already diverging the moment the ships chose which port to sail into. But the biggest difference, the one that makes people the most uncomfortable, wasn't about which part of Africa people came from. It was about what happened to their bloodlines after they arrived. Think about what that regional concentration actually meant day to day. In Bahia, someone taken from the Bight of Benin was likely surrounded by others who spoke a related language, prayed to the same spirits, and remembered the same homeland. That closeness allowed culture to survive. It's hard to erase a people who can still speak to each other in their own language. In much of the American South, the opposite happened on purpose. Enslavers frequently mixed people from completely different regions, specifically so they couldn't understand one another, couldn't organize, and couldn't hold on to a shared identity. Breaking people apart was used deliberately as a method of control. That single strategy echoes through both the DNA and the culture today. It's part of why Brazil managed to keep entire religious systems intact, while the United States saw African languages and belief systems broken down, mixed together, and rebuilt into something new. Neither outcome was kind. One preserved African memory almost by geographic accident. The other buried it under deliberate policy. But both left behind a genetic signature that a modern DNA test can read without needing to know a single fact of history. And the story of these shipping routes goes even deeper than most people ever learn. The Caribbean wasn't just a stopover point. It was a brutal filtering system. Islands like Barbados and Jamaica absorbed enormous numbers of enslaved Africans, worked huge numbers of them to death in the sugarcane fields, and then sent survivors and their children onward to other destinations. So the ancestry that eventually reached the mainland had already been sorted, mixed, and reshaped by what happened on those islands first. When researchers lined up modern genetic data against the historical paper trail, the mismatches they found weren't errors in the data. The mismatch itself was evidence of the crime showing up in the numbers. There's something almost unbearable about watching a population disappear from the historical record this way. A region that's supplied tens of thousands of human beings can leave behind only a faint trace in the DNA of people alive today. Not because those people never existed, but because the system that captured them made sure they couldn't survive long enough to have descendants. The absence itself becomes evidence. Silence in the DNA record becomes its own kind of testimony. This brings us to the number that really changed the entire conversation. Once scientists stopped only tracking where people came from and started measuring what got mixed into their descendants once they arrived, the sanitized version of history completely fell apart. When an African American takes a modern ancestry test today, the average result usually surprises people. On average, an African American carries around 73% African ancestry, about 24% European ancestry, and just under 1% Native American ancestry. That European portion is the part that stops people in their tracks, because it didn't come from consensual relationships or quiet romances. It came overwhelmingly from European men and African women, repeated generation after generation, which is really just a clinical way of describing what power looked like on a plantation. Researchers keep returning to this same pattern. European fathers and African mothers, over and over across centuries. This isn't a minor detail buried in the data. It's one of the clearest genetic fingerprints of slavery that exists anywhere, and it shows up in people's chromosomes with brutal consistency. Male lines descending from European men survived and multiplied. Male lines descending from enslaved African men were suppressed, cut short, erased. In the coldest, most factual terms, DNA remembers exactly who held power and who didn't, and it doesn't soften that story to spare anyone's feelings. Now, hold that American average in your mind and turn to Brazil, because Brazil won't give you a single clean number at all. Brazilian ancestry exists on a spectrum, not inside a fixed category. In the United States, laws spent centuries forcing people into exactly two boxes. You were either classified as black or classified as white, and even a small amount of African ancestry placed you permanently on one side of that line. This was an actual legal principle known as the one-drop rule, and it did something strange to the country's genetic landscape. It kept racial categories rigid, even as ancestry itself kept blending underneath the surface. After slavery ended, segregation physically kept these two populations apart, which meant African ancestry within black communities in America stayed relatively high and relatively stable over time. Brazil took the completely opposite path, and it did so deliberately. There was no one-drop rule in Brazil. Instead, there was a wide spectrum of skin color with dozens of different terms describing every shade in between. And sitting above all of that was a national project that Brazil's elite openly referred to as branqueamento, meaning whitening. After slavery ended, the Brazilian government actively encouraged mass immigration from Europe. Millions of Italians, Portuguese, Germans, and Spaniards arrived, with the openly stated goal of diluting the country's African population out of existence over a few generations. The belief was that if enough European ancestry got mixed into the population, black Brazilians would essentially disappear as a distinct group, sit with what that actually meant on a genetic level. In the United States, racism operated through separation. It drew a hard boundary and forced people to stay on their assigned side of it, which ended up preserving distinct African ancestry. In Brazil, racism operated through absorption. It tried to erase black identity not by keeping people apart, but by breeding blackness out of the population generation after generation, all while wrapping the entire project in the language of racial harmony. This explains why a large number of Brazilians who identify as white today actually carry substantial African ancestry without realizing it, and why Afro-Brazilians often show significantly more European and indigenous ancestry mixed in than their African American counterparts. Two different systems of racism produce two entirely different genetic outcomes, both permanently written into the blood of their descendants. Brazil even sold the rest of the world a beautiful myth built on top of all this. For most of the 20th century, the country marketed itself internationally as a racial democracy, a place supposedly free of the racism that scarred the United States, a harmonious blend where skin color simply didn't matter. The DNA tells you exactly what that harmony actually was. It wasn't equality, it was a whitening campaign dressed up in the language of a melting pot. And the genetic record kept every receipt. The very mixing that Brazil pointed to as proof of its tolerance was, in large part, the biological residue of a deliberate plan to make black Brazilians disappear. Then came a study that pulled all of these threads together and finally put hard numbers on this horror. When researchers analyzed DNA from more than 50,000 people across the Americas and compared it against historical shipping records, they uncovered something that directly contradicts the raw history of the slave trade. Most of the people forced onto slave ships were men. The majority of captives transported across the Atlantic were male. And yet, When you look at whose genetic material actually survived into today's population, it's enslaved women who passed down far more DNA than enslaved men did. Think about what that gap actually requires to be true. If far more men were shipped across the ocean, but far more women's DNA survived into later generations, then something was systematically stopping enslaved men from having surviving children, while systematically forcing enslaved women to bear them. That something has a name, and most people already know exactly what it is. This imbalance in the data is the mathematical trace left behind by mass sexual violence, alongside enslaved men being worked to death or denied the chance to start families. The researchers didn't use gentle language to describe something this ugly, and there's no reason we should either. The gene pool of 2 entire nations was shaped in measurable part by rape. And this same study found that the pattern played out differently depending on the country, which brings us right back to where we started. In the United States, the tilt toward European male ancestry and African female ancestry was severe, the genetic fingerprint of both the plantation system and the one-drop rule pressing down together. In Brazil and across the wider Caribbean, the whitening policies pushed that dilution even further, stacking wave after wave of European immigration on top of the original violence. The same underlying crime, expressed through 2 different national strategies, produced 2 very different genomes. Zoom in on Brazil for a moment, because even within one single country, the DNA refuses to stay uniform. A black Brazilian from the northeast, from Bahia or Pernambuco, tends to carry a heavier, more concentrated African genetic signature, the direct inheritance of the sugar plantations that ran on West African labor. Travel south toward São Paulo and the states below it, and the picture shifts dramatically. That's where most European immigration actually landed, so ancestry there is far more blended and diluted. The whitening project wasn't applied evenly across the country. It hit hardest in the regions where the elite most wanted the population to change, and the genome maps out the campaign region by region. The scale of all this is hard to fully grasp. More than half of Brazil's population now identifies as black or mixed race, over 100 million people carrying some measurable amount of African ancestry, making Brazil home to one of the largest populations of African descent anywhere on Earth, including the African continent itself. Yet for most of its history, the country treated that ancestry as something to quietly breed away, rather than something to celebrate. The DNA tests people are taking today are, in a strange way, slowly undoing that erasure. Every test result that comes back with unexpected African ancestry is a small correction to a story the nation told about itself for 100 years. Compare that to the American experience, and the contrast sharpens even further. Because the enslaved population in the United States grew mainly through birth rather than constant new arrivals, African Americans today share a denser web of common ancestors, a more tightly interconnected family tree that genealogists find genuinely remarkable. Many African Americans who take DNA tests at random turn out to be distant cousins, descendants of a relatively small founding population that multiplied under generations of bondage. Brazil, fed by a much larger and constantly replenished stream of captives, carries a wider, more scattered collection of African lineages. One nation concentrated its people through a slower form of cruelty. The other scattered them through a faster, more consuming form of cruelty. The DNA carries the evidence of both. There's one more layer worth mentioning because it explains why these test results hit people so hard emotionally. For a black American, an ancestry result pointing to a specific region, the Yoruba, the Akan, the Congo, can feel like getting back something that slavery deliberately stole, a name for a homeland that was erased on purpose. For a black Brazilian, that same kind of result can feel like a quiet act of rebellion against a country that spent generations insisting the African part of their identity didn't really count. The number on the screen is never just a number. It's a fragment of a stolen identity being handed back centuries late by a piece of technology that no one standing in that slave market could ever have imagined. There's a way to see this violence with almost surgical precision, and it lives inside 2 very specific parts of the human genome. Mitochondrial DNA passes down only through the mother, forming an unbroken maternal chain stretching back through history. When scientists read that maternal chain separately from the paternal line in black populations across the Americas, they find a split that shouldn't exist in a population that formed through mutual consent. The maternal line reads overwhelmingly African. The paternal line carries a heavy European signature. In other words, the mothers came from Africa, and a large share of the fathers came from Europe, not by choice, but by force. And these 2 genetic chains preserve that fact completely independently of each other. You cannot argue with a maternal line. It doesn't lie, and it doesn't soften anything. It has been quietly carrying this testimony for 300 years, waiting for someone to finally read it. So let's bring those 2 men back, the one born in Salvador and the one born in Atlanta. At the start, they looked like they should be genetic brothers. Now you can see exactly why they aren't. The man from Bahia likely carries a concentrated genetic signature from the Bight of Benin, the same Yoruba heritage that survives today in Candomblé, layered with generations of European immigration that Brazil specifically invited in order to lighten him. The man from Atlanta likely carries a blended African signature drawn from across the entire West African coastline, reshuffled through the Caribbean, combined with roughly a quarter European ancestry, tracing back to the men who once owned his ancestors. And almost none of the later European immigration that reshaped Brazil. Here's the part nobody really wanted to say out loud. Stated as plainly as possible, race is not some fixed biological fact that these two countries simply happen to report on. Race is something each country built deliberately on top of the exact same raw human material. The United States built a wall, Brazil built a blender, and the science shows, without much room for argument, that the word black carries a genetically different meaning in Salvador than it does in Atlanta. Not because Africa itself was different, but because the machinery of slavery and everything that followed it was different in each place. Ancestry isn't destiny. It's a record of what was done. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath everything we've covered today. For generations, people argued about race as though it were fixed in the blood, permanent and beyond question. DNA has finally answered that argument, and the answer flips it completely on its head. What's written in the blood isn't race. What's written in the blood is history. Every single percentage point represents a decision someone made. A port a ship chose to sail into. A policy a government decided to pass. A violence that was allowed to happen without consequence. The genome isn't a verdict on who these people are, it's a confession of what was done to them. And maybe that's the real reason nobody wanted to say this out loud for so long. Because once you understand that the difference between black Brazilians and black Americans isn't natural but manufactured, you can't look at either country's story the same way again. You can't call Brazil a racial democracy. You can't pretend the American color line was ever really about biology. These two men aren't different because their ancestors were different people. They're different because of what was done to those ancestors on two opposite sides of the same ocean. Same roots, same catastrophe, two entirely different outcomes engineered over centuries.